we're very pleased to welcome Amy de Korn from the University of Oslo, who has come to speak to us on Repertoires of Language Activism in Oaxaca. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, buenas tardes, everyone. I'm going to do my best to keep you awake after lunch. It's been great discussion so far, and I hope I have a few things to contribute. So thank you very much to Rosaline for the opportunity to be here. My background is as an applied linguist or an educational linguist, but I use ethnography in my work to look at language and inequality in education settings. So this meetings of different disciplines feels very relevant and very exciting for me. So I'm going to start off with a translated quote of a young woman who is studying Zapotec in a formal university class. And in this interview, she's talking about the attitudes of her classmates towards Zapotec. She says it's really difficult to take away the prejudices that they already have about what is a dialect and what is a language. No, they're not interested at all much. I ask, you don't think that you're changing the point of view of people? Yeah, no, it's just, yeah, you can't. No, they already think that way, and it's really difficult. Well, my mom, yes. My mom believed it was a dialect, so bit by bit I've been explaining to her, and now it's stuck. Now she doesn't refer to Zapotec or any language as a dialect, rather as a language. So yes, my family, but people that know me, no. So I'm showing this conversation to bring out 2 points that are threads throughout this presentation, and I think also throughout our meeting. We know there are persistent prejudices towards indigenous and other marginalized languages in Mexico, in many parts of Latin America, and the rest of the world. And we're very interested in these ways that people's prejudices can change, and then not just their prejudices, but then also their practices. So this idea of being able not to change the views of all of her classmates, but bit by bit, her own mother, one person changed their perception of Zapotec. So these kinds of small, bottom-up approaches to supporting minoritized languages is what I'm mainly talking about today. And I'm looking at even these very small kinds of actions as part of a wider project of language activism. So I'll talk briefly about issues of language equality and activism and the questions of critical language scholarship that Rosaline posed to us. And then I'll draw on some examples from my own ethnographic work of Isthmus Zapotec or Dijasa promotion. So as Carla already introduced us in the Mexican context, on the legal level, the jure level, there's a lovely law for the linguistic rights of indigenous pueblos indígenas, indigenous peoples. And Isthmus Zapotec, among the 364 languages that are recognized in Mexico, Isthmus Zapotec is one of the ones that would be considered healthier, the widest, the most spoken of various Zapotec languages in the southern part of Oaxaca state here. However, indigenous languages and cultures throughout Mexico are often commodified, or often viewed as a symbol of ignorance, of poverty, of the past. They're often viewed with this prejudice as being a dialecto and not a lengua, idioma. And if we look more closely at the Isthmus Zapotec region, there's very few areas where children are learning Isthmus Zapotec at home. So it's very much in a process of displacement with more and more Spanish coming into the region. So if we want to try to change this situation of language hierarchy and inequality, one approach is this of language rights and recognition. But in cases like Mexico and many other cases, we see that these rights and recognition policies have not changed the practices on the ground. As Lionel Lee writes, this approach of trying to promote universal rights for diverse languages doesn't work for many reasons, one of which is that neither groups and their members nor their cultural practices are ontologically fixed and homogeneous entities, as we've been talking about. And a rights discourse tends to treat them in that way, tends to essentialize languages, and is one of the reasons why it doesn't work. We could also say that this doesn't work in practice because it's a political rhetoric and there isn't the real will to make the change on the ground. So we don't want to throw out the idea of linguistic equality, though, right? This is still a sort of broad aim that we have. In my work, I've started to think of language equality as a social imaginary, drawing on Charles Taylor, who defines a social imaginary as the ways in which people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions that underlie these expectations. So within common human rights discourses, as well as within our disciplines of linguistics, anthropology, we have this social imaginary that all languages are equal. This is, for us, a normative notion that languages all have the same value and should all be treated the same. But we know that we're far from making that happen in reality. We know that local actors are a very crucial part of changing reality. So the top-down policies haven't done it. They're part of the picture. I'm not saying throughout the policy, but we know that local bottom-up actors are very important, both in interpreting those policies and in making new realities on the ground. So in looking at language activism, which is my focus for the rest of the talk, it's very clear that this is not a universalist endeavor, whereas language rights have this universalist kind of tenor to them. Language activism does not, and it always includes a different imaginaries of social change. So there's different priorities for what kinds of change should occur, and different, what Susan Cochrane Smith and Lytle call theories of action about how language change can occur. So in looking at language activism or advocacy as this social project that can have different priorities and different ways of occurring, one of the challenges that I have as a scholar participating in language activism is this kind of dual nature of being a constructivist but also being an activist. So those of us who work in anthropology or sociolinguistics, we would all agree that social reality is co-constructed, it's subjectively experienced, and there's multiple understandings of reality that are valid. But when we're engaging in activism or pursuit of social change, typically we have commitment to a certain defined goal or action based on a certain understanding of reality. And typically we're attempting to make some changes in that reality and potentially shift other people's understandings. So this is a very delicate balancing act to take as an activist who's also a social constructivist. And this is part of the approach to language activism that I'm trying to work with. So within this approach, I have three key assumptions. One is that language has many different meanings. It means different things for different people. Also that positive social change can have different meanings for different people, and that ways of pursuing positive change can also be multiple or diverse. And if we look at the different areas of scholarship that have contributed to trying to promote language equality or counter inequalities, there's a lot of different examples we can draw from. And I wanted to just throw in a few that you may or may not be familiar with already. I just threw this one in based on the conversations this morning. If you're not familiar with the work of Wesley Leonard, who's a Miami linguist, who's working recently on what he calls language reclamation, which is a move beyond a focus on direct language measures, such as creating new speakers, which he links to the popular paradigm of language revitalization, whereas language reclamation would focus on incorporating community epistemologies, such as how language is defined and given sociocultural meaning. So he has a paper on producing language reclamation by decolonizing language, and it's in a special issue of the Journal of Language and Documentation that he and I co-edited, that's open access online, that you can download it all, and there's quite a few articles in there on collaborative revitalization initiatives from different angles. So I just had to give a shout out to that based on the discussion so far. I also want to give a shout out to Ana Celia Zantea and her call for the need for an anthropolitical linguistics. She says that we need to understand and facilitate a stigmatized group's attempts to construct a positive self within an economic and political context that relegates its members to static and disparaged ethnic, racial, and class identities, and that identifies them with static and disparaged linguistic codes. So although Zentea was working within a code switching framework, which some people would now say, oh, code switching is so old-fashioned, she was doing it to try to change the disparaged nature of the Puerto Rican English code switching codes that her community she was a member of and works in uses. And the paradigm of interactional sociolinguistics or educational linguistics has also for a long time tried to make this bridge between sociolinguistic theory and activism or engagement. So Delheims wrote that we need to go beyond a liberal humanism which merely recognizes the abstract potentiality of all languages to a humanism which can deal with concrete situations, with the inequalities that actually obtain, and help to transform them through knowledge of the ways in which language is actually organized as a human problem and resource. So although we have this broad idea of wanting to look at the different diverse realities of language, we need to go beyond that to say, okay, from that, now how do we engage with the inequalities that are occurring in concrete situations, and how do we help to change some of those inequalities if we can? One approach that Himes and others have taken up to try to work towards that is called ethnographic monitoring, which links ethnography of communication with different forms of action research in a broad and flexible way, beginning with classical observation, describing what is going on with language use or communication, in particular noticing inequalities and or positive or aspects of well-being around language, interpreting emic perspectives, imaginaries, aspirations, in particular, what does it mean to succeed or fail here? What do people want to occur in relation to language or communication in this setting? And then engaging, if possible, in a way that seems appropriate. So this is the broad framework that I've been using in conducting ethnography in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in southern Oaxaca in Mexico, where I've spent about 25 months between 2013 and 2018. I haven't been there this year, unfortunately, looking at different sites where Isthmus Zapotec or Dijaza is being promoted in different ways. And in some sites, I've spent a lot more time than others and become engaged myself, and in other sites, I've been more of a participant observer. And so what I'll pull out of this broader study for today's talk is looking at some of the strategies that Isthmus Zapotec language activists are using, and some of the imaginaries of social change that they talk about in relation to their strategies. And I'll go through quite quickly and give some examples. When I'm talking about Isthmus Zapotec language activists, I'm talking about people of different identity categories who are engaging in the promotion of Isthmus Zapotec in different ways. So I don't mean people who identify as Isthmus Zapotec and then promote Isthmus Zapotec language, but also, for instance, linguists like myself who would engage in promoting the language in various ways. So there's a lot of different activism initiatives that we can see in the region, which I'm sure you would recognize in your own context. Of course, there's some things going on in schools. There's different things coming out of universities, both local, national, and international. There's different community-based of the different strategies that people are using. There's 3 key actions of creating, connecting, and representing, and these are targeted at 5 goals of resources, events, spaces and structures, people or identities, and communication practices. And I'll give you some quick examples of what I mean by these. So creating resources. We've already seen multiple examples of this as an activism strategy today. If you're a pedagogue, an education person like myself, you probably want to create didactic resources and learning materials. Perfect, thank you. If you're a linguist, you might want to create a dictionary or a database. This is a very common and immediate response for many people saying, what do we do for language? Let's make a thing that will promote the language. These resources, whether it's digital or physical, have the advantage of often being fairly visible. They can be put up on social media, they can circulate, and it doesn't take so long to create these kinds of things. It takes a bit of time, of course, but not so long. But through observing what was going on in this particular site and others that I've been involved in, a lot of questions emerge about what is the impact of a learning resource over time. Not all of them are getting used. A lot of them are sitting on the shelf, and not all of them are reaching a lot of the intended audience. Another strategy of creating a space or a structure, such as creating a workshop, a program, or a certification within a university setting, for instance, requires a longer engagement in the local context. It often involves fewer people coming in, only so many people are going to fit in the door. It often can take longer to create this kind of space or structure, but there is an aim at something a bit more sustainable, potentially a bit more significant in the impact than a material that you leave and walk away from and you don't know what happens to it. Within the creation of a space or a structure, such as a learning program, there's great opportunity for creating different communication practices. So this is a picture of an adult Zapotec class where they're singing a song that they've written in Isthmus Zapotec. So this communication practice of using Isthmus Zapotec is something that, in this case, occurred briefly. They did it in one class, but it would not have happened without the existing space of that class, which was in a wider university space that was supporting the classes. Also, within these more enduring spaces, there's more opportunity to create what we could call a certain kind of person or a certain kind of identity. So again, within this university setting, the supporting of young Isthmus Zapotec speakers to become Isthmus Zapotec teachers, to identify as a competent Isthmus Zapotec teacher, or supporting the students in the class to identify as an Isthmus Zapotec learner and or speaker, depending on their degree of competence, is something that needs a social scaffolding to support the emergence of these kinds of identities. And connecting different people is also an important strategy. In this case, members of a community that were starting to create a language program are meeting with a young woman who's already been teaching Isthmus Zapotec. They're exchanging knowledge and perspectives. So connecting the diverse people who are doing their own thing in their own corner, who don't always talk to each other, is something that could happen fairly quickly and might lead to important things in the future. Also connecting people with resources that already exist that they might not be aware of. And finally, just quick examples for these things. Representation is something that we all do all the time, right? How do we represent certain language practices, certain communication practices? How do we represent certain people? As linguists, as scholars, when we come in, if we only talk to the elder native speaker of a language, we're representing that person is very important, which is great, which is true. But what about the younger speakers? What about other people in the community? This picture here in the corner is two guys from the group Huchi Rap, which is a hip-hop group, which, since this picture was taken in 2014, they're now doing really awesome things. So they're performing Isthmus Zapotec rap to a university audience, and this was a way of representing Isthmus Zapotec as cool to the university students. These are bilingual teachers who are on stage talking about their pedagogical practices to a wider audience. So again, creating a space where they're represented as experts and their knowledge of the language is represented as important. And there's many more examples, but does just a quick overview. Again, looking at different strategies that are occurring amongst different actors, there's some important characteristics that can be pointed out. So some are occurring very much on a local scale, and some draw much more on international support. Some are not very visible, are quite local, and some might aim to be much more visible. Some occur quickly, some take more time. Some focus very much on an idea of tradition and often purism. Others have more of a future focus. And I'm almost out of time, so just to come to the final point of the talk, which is how do all of these different strategies, these different things that language activists are doing relate to achieving social change, achieving a better status for speakers of this language. One of the imaginaries of social change that people, in particular working at the local level, will talk about fairly often in this context is the idea of aportar un grano de arena, contributing a grain of sand. And this is something that people say again and again when they're talking about what they're doing in relation to Isthmus Zapotec language or culture. He contributed his grain of sand, the school wants to contribute its grain of sand, and there's many of these examples. So for me, this idea of contributing a grain of sand is a slow, incremental, non-teleological approach to social change, and it also incorporates this idea that anyone can do this and anyone should do it. You don't have to be an expert to contribute a grain of sand. And this is quite different than some of the imaginaries of change that we get from areas of scholarship, also NGO type projects about quote-unquote saving or revitalizing a language, solving social problems, reaching educational benchmarks that are discourses of urgency, totality, with a predetermined endpoint, and often involve some kind of expert plan or intervention in order to be carried out. So to wrap up, because I'm out of time, I argue that language activism in contexts such as this requires a repertoire of flexible and adaptable strategies with as many actors involved as possible, so local actors and social networks, as well as the top-down policy makers and the formal teachers in the classroom. And I also think it's important to validate some of the less visible, smaller scale strategies, as well as the ones that are gaining more attention. And also important to validate different imaginaries or experiences of how social change around language can occur. So thank you. Gracias.